The cold came down from the mountain like a judgment. It settled in the hollows and clung to the undersides of fir boughs, a damp weight that promised an early snow. The air tasted of wet stone and pine resin, sharp and clean in a way that scoured the lungs. Rowan breathed it in, a measured inhalation, and let it out in a plume of white that dissolved into the gray mist. The forest was 1,000 shades of green and brown, muted under the flat silver sky. It was a landscape that kept its secrets. He understood that. He preferred it. He walked with a quiet economy of motion, his boots making little sound on the damp carpet of needles and moss. His field jacket, worn soft and familiar at the elbows, smelled of wood smoke and distance. Years of discipline had carved away any unnecessary movement, leaving only the essentials. He scanned the tree line, his gaze never resting, cataloging the sway of a branch, the dark space between cedars, the way the mist coiled and uncoiled like a living thing. It was a habit he could not unlearn, a form of prayer for a man who had forgotten the words. 10 feet ahead, the dog moved with the same silent purpose. Sergeant. The name was a legacy, not a choice. He was a German shepherd of classical lines, black and tan, his coat thick against the encroaching winter. His muscles moved with a liquid grace beneath his skin, a testament to a life of work. He was not a pet, he was a partner. His presence was a solid, reassuring weight in the vast, indifferent quiet of the wilderness. He did not sniff randomly or chase the scent of a squirrel. His head was up, his ears working, his dark, intelligent eyes taking inventory of the world with a focus that mirrored Rowan's own. Rowan felt the shift before he saw it. It was a subtle break in the rhythm of their passage through the woods. The soft padding of the dog's paws ceased. Rowan stopped, his hand hovering near the worn grip of the knife on his belt. He listened. There was only the whisper of wind through the high branches and the steady, patient drip of water from leaf to ground. Nothing. Sargent stood perfectly still on the narrow game trail. His body was a study in tension. Not the aggressive posture of a threat detected, but the deep, resonant stillness of something recognized. His head was cocked, his gaze fixed on a place downslope, a tangle of alder and vine maple that choked a small, unnamed ravine. His tail was low and motionless. It was a signal Rowan knew intimately. It did not mean danger. It meant wrongness. "What is it, boy?" Rowan's voice was a low rasp, swallowed by the damp air. The dog did not look back. His entire being was focused on that spot below. A low whine, thin and tight, escaped his throat. It was a sound of confusion, of a memory struggling against instinct. Rowan moved forward slowly, placing his boots with deliberate care. He came to stand beside the dog, his eyes following the animal's unwavering stare. He put a hand on the dog's neck, feeling the rigid muscle beneath the thick fur. The fur was warm, a small point of life in the pervasive cold. "I see it," Rowan murmured, though at first he did not. There was only the dense, chaotic green of the undergrowth, a wall of vegetation that seemed impenetrable. But Sargent's focus was absolute, and Rowan had learned long ago to trust the dog's senses over his own. He narrowed his eyes, letting the patterns resolve. And then he saw it. A line that was too straight, a patch of color that did not belong, a dull, unnatural gleam of faded red against the green, almost lost in the shadows. It was a piece of metal, bent and scarred, tangled in the roots of an ancient hemlock. Rust bloomed across its surface like a disease, a deep orange that bled into the moss. It was part of something larger, something broken and half swallowed by the forest floor. The mountain wore its silence like a uniform, but here, that silence felt different. It felt like a held breath. The routine was broken. The simple trail inspection had ended. Something else had begun. Rowan gave the dog's neck a firm squeeze, a silent command. Together, they began to move down the steep, slick embankment, toward the thing that should not have been there. The descent was slow. Rowan used the tough, wiry branches of huckleberry bushes as handholds, his boots sinking into the soft, black earth. The smell of decay grew stronger, not the clean rot of the forest, but something else. The acrid tang of old fuel, the scent of rust and cold, dead steel. Sargent moved ahead, his paws sure-footed, his body low to the ground. He paused every few feet, looking back at Rowan, a silent question in his eyes. He was leading, but he was also checking, ensuring his man was still there. They reached the bottom of the ravine, a narrow crease in the land where water pooled and ferns grew in lush profusion. Here, the wreck was fully visible. It was the fuselage of a small aircraft, a single-engine prop plane, split open like a seed pod. It had been here a long time, decades. The forest was methodically reclaiming it, weaving branches through broken windows, covering torn metal with a blanket of moss. The rust spread across the hull like a wound that refused to scab. Rowan circled the wreck slowly, his hand never far from his knife. His senses were wide open, absorbing every detail. The impact had been violent. The nose was buried in the earth, the wings sheared off, the tail twisted at an impossible angle. Yet, it felt less like a crash site and more like a tomb. The silence was profound. No birds sang nearby. The air was heavy, still. The wreck watched them, he thought, the way old debts watch from across a room. Sargent was not circling. The dog had gone directly to the fractured opening of the main cabin. He stood with his front paws on the buckled metal floor, his head inside the dark space, sniffing the stagnant air. He did not bark. He did not growl. He whined again, that same low, troubled sound. It was the sound of a question he couldn't ask. "Easy," Rowan said, his voice soft. He approached the opening, his boots crunching on shattered plexiglass. The inside of the plane was a mess of torn upholstery, dangling wires, and the accumulated debris of seasons. A fine layer of green dust, pollen and mold coated everything. The smell was thick with damp, decay, and the ghost of aviation fuel. It was a smell that hooked into his memory, pulling at something he kept locked away. He saw evidence of survival. The straps on the passenger seats had been cut cleanly, not torn. A small stack of canned goods, their labels long since faded to illegible pulp, sat in a rusted, orderly pile in a corner. A tarnished silver flask lay next to them. Someone had lived here. Someone had waited. Sargent pushed deeper into the cabin, his claws scraping against the metal. He ignored the seats, the controls, the debris. He moved with purpose toward the rear of the aircraft, to a small, enclosed cargo space. The door was slightly ajar. The dog nudged it with his nose, then looked back at Rowan, his gaze intense. It landed on him with the weight of a hand on his shoulder. Rowan crouched, peering into the darkness. The smell of cold steel and something else, something animal and familiar. Wet fur. He pulled a small, powerful flashlight from a pouch on his belt. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a small, metal-lined compartment. It was a transport crate, a canine transport crate, the kind used in military operations. The air in his lungs turned to ice. The scent of ozone, the metallic tang of blood, the tight, confined space. The memory wasn't a thought. It was a physical sensation. The jarring impact. The scream of tearing metal. The sudden, violent silence that followed. The dust, thick and choking, glittering in the narrow beams of their helmet lamps. He was somewhere else, somewhere hot and dry, a world away from this damp green forest. He was kneeling, his hands searching, feeling for a pulse that wasn't there. The name was on his lips, a wordless cry. Elias. A wet nose pressed hard against his cheek, firm, insistent. It was a grounding touch, pulling him back from the edge of the memory. He blinked, the green of the forest flooding his vision again, sharp and painfully real. Sargent was beside him, his head pushed against Rowan's, his warm breath fogging the cold air. The dog's eyes were fixed on his, steady and deep. There was no alarm in them, only a quiet, unwavering presence. He stayed like that until Rowan's breathing evened out, until the tremor in his hands subsided. "Yeah," Rowan breathed, his voice rough. "I'm here." He turned the light back into the crate. It was empty, save for a thick blanket folded neatly in the corner. On top of the blanket, as if placed there deliberately, was a single object. It was a square of faded fabric, dark blue with a pattern of white stars. A bandana. It was clean, or had been when it was left. Now it was just damp, holding the chill of the wreck. Sargent lowered his head and with infinite gentleness picked up the bandana in his mouth. He backed out of the fuselage, the fabric held carefully, and sat on the mossy ground. He did not chew it. He did not drop it. He simply held it, looking at Rowan. Rowan knelt in front of the dog. He knew that bandana. He had seen it 100 times, tied around a wrist, wiping sweat from a brow, or tucked into a pocket. The frayed edge where a corner had been torn. The specific faded shade of blue. It was Elias's. Elias, his teammate, the man who had been Sargent's first handler. The man Rowan had been too late to save. He reached out a hand, his fingers hesitating just above the fabric. The dog sat, patient, unmoving. He held the bandana not as a toy, but as a message. A piece of a story that had been waiting in the cold and the dark for years. Rowan finally took it from the dog's mouth. The fabric was cold and damp, but in his mind he could feel the warmth of the man who had worn it. He could smell the dust and sun of a faraway desert. The wreck was not a tomb. It was a testament. Elias hadn't died in the crash. He had survived. He had waited. And he had left this here, in the crate that had carried his partner. For Sargent. For the one he knew would never stop looking. But Sargent hadn't been there. He'd been stateside, injured. Rowan had been the one on the ground, miles from the real crash site, led astray by faulty intelligence. He had searched for a body that was never there. The guilt was a physical thing, a cold weight in his gut that was heavier than the mountain. He had failed him. He had stopped looking. He had gone home, taking Elias's dog, his grief a secret he carried like a splinter of shrapnel near the heart. Now, the forest had given that secret back. Sargent nudged Rowan's hand, the one holding the bandana. He licked the back of it once, a rough, warm swipe of his tongue. It was an affirmation. I remember him too. The dog's posture had changed again. He was no longer confused. He was guarding. He sat beside Rowan, a sentinel watching over a memory that had just been unearthed. He was not just Rowan's dog anymore. In that moment, he was Elias's dog again. And he was home. Rowan stood up, folding the bandana carefully and tucking it into the inner pocket of his jacket against his chest. The damp fabric felt like a patch of ice over his heart. He had to report this. The wreck, the evidence of a survivor. It would mean questions, forms, people. It would mean digging up a past he had tried to bury under miles of solitude and silence. Before he could make a move, a sound cut through the quiet. The crack of a branch from the ridge above them. Sharp, deliberate, not an animal. Rowan's hand went to his knife instinctively. Sargent was on his feet in an instant, a low, almost inaudible rumble starting deep in his chest. He didn't bark. He didn't need to. His body was a clear and present warning. He stood between Rowan and the direction of the sound, a living shield. A figure appeared at the top of the ravine, silhouetted against the gray sky. For a heart-stopping second, the shape was just a man, and a wild, impossible hope flared in Rowan's chest. But the light shifted, and the silhouette resolved into a familiar form. It was not the ghost he was half expecting. Rowan? The voice was calm, laced with a familiar warmth that cut through the cold air. It was Caleb. He stood there in jeans and a heavy canvas work coat, a thermos in one hand. His dark hair was damp from the mist. He must have been on his way to the cabin. He often was, showing up with coffee, or a piece of hardware to fix the porch rail that was always coming loose, or for no reason at all. He just appeared, a quiet constant in Rowan's deliberately solitary life. Rowan raised a hand, a small, tight gesture of acknowledgement. Caleb. Caleb started down the slope, moving with a surprising agility for a man who spent his days fixing engines and framing walls. His eyes were on the wreck, then on Rowan, then on the rigid posture of the dog. He stopped a few feet away, taking in the scene without needing it explained. He saw the cut straps, the open crate, the deep, unsettled gravity in Rowan's stance. Heard you were checking the North Trail, Caleb said, his voice quiet. He held up the thermos. Figured you'd be cold. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. He didn't ask what Rowan had found. He just looked at his friend's face, at the raw grief and shock etched there, and his own expression softened with a concern that asked for nothing in return. He simply stood there, a silent offer of presence, a buffer against the crushing weight of the discovery. Rowan felt something in his chest unclench, a knot he hadn't realized was there. It was a flicker of warmth, an ache he did not examine. The call to the Forest Service was unavoidable. Rowan used the satellite phone from his pack, his His voice clipped and precise as he gave the coordinates and a sparse description of the site. He omitted the personal details. Wreckage of a small aircraft, evidence of long-term survival. That was all they needed to know for now. The bandana was a cold weight in his pocket, a secret he wasn't ready to share with a stranger over a crackling line. Jenna Martinez, the district ranger, arrived 2 hours later. She moved through the woods with the same quiet competence as Rowan, her uniform crisp despite the damp, her face serious and professional. She was in her late 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a tight braid and eyes that missed nothing. She respected Rowan, saw him as a fellow professional who simply wore a different kind of uniform now. She surveyed the scene, her gaze lingering on the cut seatbelts and the stacked cans. "You were right," she said, nodding to Rowan. "Someone walked away from this." She knelt by the fuselage, her gloved fingers tracing the rusted edge of the torn metal. "Logbooks are gone. No VIN plate on the dash. Anything with an ID has been stripped. Professional." "Or desperate," Rowan said. Jenna looked at him, then at Sargent, who sat patiently a few feet away, watching her every move. "The dog find it?" "He knew it was here," Rowan answered, the distinction important. She nodded, accepting this. She'd seen enough of the bond between Rowan and the canine to know it transcended simple training. She documented the site with a camera, her movements efficient. Caleb had stayed, a silent, steady presence on the edge of the clearing. He had poured Rowan a cup of coffee from his thermos, the steam rising in the cold air, and then simply waited, leaning against a tree, his role unspoken but understood. He was there to watch Rowan's back. It was late afternoon when the other vehicle arrived. Not the rugged Forest Service truck Jenna drove, but a pristine, dark green SUV that seemed utterly out of place in the wilderness. It parked as close as the rough track would allow, and 2 men got out. They wore expensive outdoor gear that looked like it had been purchased that morning. Clean boots, crisp jackets, pleasant smiles. The man in the lead was in his 50s, with silvering hair and a face that was accustomed to being trusted. He moved with a smooth, unhurried confidence. He approached Jenna, his hand outstretched. "Jenna, good to see you," he said, his voice a warm, reasonable baritone. "Mark Thorne. We spoke on the phone, Green River Conservancy." Jenna shook his hand, her expression guarded. "Mr. Thorne, this is a restricted area now." Of course," Thorne said, his smile never faltering. He glanced at the wreck, a flicker of something, not surprise, but confirmation, in his eyes. "A terrible tragedy. We were notified by your office about a discovery on land adjacent to our trust. We came to offer our full cooperation." His gaze swept over the scene and settled on Rowan. "And this must be the gentleman who found it. A public service. We're all in your debt." Rowan said nothing. He watched the man's eyes. They were friendly, open, but they didn't match the smile. They were assessing, calculating. Sargent, who had been sitting calmly, now rose to his feet. The shift was subtle, but it was there. His back straightened. His head came up. A low rumble, too deep for human ears to register clearly, vibrated through the ground. The dog's gaze was locked on Thorne. It was not a growl, not a bark. It was a controlled, definitive statement of warning. Thorne's smile tightened by a fraction of an inch. He took a half step back, his affable demeanor momentarily disrupted. "Quite the animal," he said, his voice a little cooler. "He's a good judge of character," Rowan said, his voice flat. An uncomfortable silence hung in the air. Thorne quickly recovered his composure, turning back to Jenna. "Our concern, of course, is environmental," he said smoothly. "An old wreck like this can leach heavy metals, fuel residue. The Conservancy has resources, specialized teams. We'd be happy to take the lead on the cleanup and removal. At our own expense, naturally. We can have a crew here by morning." "This is a potential crash investigation site, Mr. Thorne," Jenna said, her tone firm. "It's under federal jurisdiction. Nothing gets removed until the NTSB and forensics have been through it." "Absolutely," Thorne agreed, holding up his hands in a gesture of placation. "But it's been decades. The trail is cold, wouldn't you say? Our priority is protecting this pristine watershed. I'm sure we can expedite the necessary paperwork. Cut through the red tape. It's what our donors expect." He gave Rowan a thoughtful look. A man like you, who chooses to live out here, must appreciate the importance of preserving the wilderness. The words were reasonable, the tone was helpful, but the intent felt like a closing fist. They weren't here to help, they were here to erase, to bury the wreck and its story under the guise of corporate philanthropy. Thorne wanted the site sanitized, and he wanted it done fast. The gap between his words and his intent was a chasm. The man who was in that plane survived, Rowan stated, his voice quiet but carrying in the still air. He lived here. He waited. Thorne's gaze flickered. A fascinating theory, but with all due respect, after so long, what are the chances? It's a sad story, but one that ended a long time ago. The best we can do now is heal the land. He gave Jenna another reassuring smile. We'll be in touch with your office in the morning to coordinate. We want to be partners in this. He gave a final brief nod to Rowan and Caleb, then turned and walked back toward his immaculate SUV. His assistant followed, casting a nervous glance back at Sargent, who remained standing, a silent, furry statue of distrust, until the vehicle's doors closed and the sound of its engine faded down the mountain. Partners, Jenna muttered under her breath, watching them go. I don't like this, Rowan. Neither does he, Rowan said, nodding toward the dog. Caleb pushed off from the tree he'd been leaning against. He walked over to Rowan, his expression grim. He looked from the wreck to the trail where the SUV had disappeared. You know, he said softly, his eyes meeting Rowan's, you don't have to do this alone. The words were simple, an offer of help, but in the quiet space between them, they held the weight of a vow. The next 48 hours were a slow-motion storm of jurisdiction and bureaucracy. Jenna did her best to hold the line, cordoning off the site and filing the official reports. But the pressure from above was immense. The Green River Conservancy, it turned out, had powerful friends and deep pockets. They donated generously to political campaigns. They sat on boards. Their calls were returned promptly. Thorne's narrative was simple and effective. An unfortunate but ancient crash site, a potential environmental hazard, and a responsible private organization stepping up to do the right thing. The story of a survivor was dismissed as romantic speculation from a reclusive, traumatized veteran. Rowan's service record, once a mark of honor, was now subtly reframed. He was portrayed as unstable, his observations clouded by PTSD. The system Thorne represented was working exactly as designed. It absorbed the truth and excreted a more convenient version. On the third day, the setback came. Jenna called, her voice tight with fury. They got a court order, citing environmental urgency. My supervisor rolled over. They're taking over the site, Rowan. A remediation team is on its way up. What about the NTSB? Rowan asked, the cold knot in his stomach tightening. Delayed, she said, the word clipped. Paperwork issues. By the time they get here, there will be nothing left to investigate. Thorne's people are going to scrub that ravine clean. Rowan drove to the trailhead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Sargent sat in the passenger seat, sensing his agitation, his presence a silent, steady ballast. But even from the access road, Rowan could see it was too late. The area was swarming with men in clean coveralls and hard hats. A mobile crane was being set up. The pristine quiet of the forest was shattered by the sound of generators and shouted commands. They were not investigating. They were dismantling, erasing. He turned the truck around. He had failed. Again. He had found Elias's final message, and he had let it be silenced. The evidence, the cut straps, the neatly stacked cans, the canine crate, it would all be hauled away as scrap metal, its story dismissed and forgotten. All he had left was the bandana in his pocket. He retreated. It was his default setting. He drove back to his cabin, the one Caleb's hands had helped make sound and whole, and he shut the world out. He didn't answer Jenna's calls. When Caleb's truck pulled up late in the afternoon, Rowan watched through the window as he got out, a container of what was probably stew in his hands, and didn't open the door. After a long moment, Caleb left the container on the porch steps and drove away. The cabin grew dark. Rowan didn't light the lamps. He sat in a chair, the cold room a reflection of the frozen landscape inside him. The guilt was a suffocating presence. He had been given a second chance to find Elias, to bring his story home, and he had lost it. The old wound, the one from that dusty, sun-scorched country, opened fully. He saw the firefight, the chaos, the bad intelligence that sent his team on a fool's errand, while Elias's plane went down miles away. He saw the face of Elias's wife, when he had to tell her they had stopped the search. He saw the moment he was given Sargent, the dog a living, breathing embodiment of his failure. He pushed people away because attachment was a liability. Connection was a promise you might not be able to keep. He had run to this mountain to be alone with his ghosts, and for a while, it had worked. But the mountain had given him a ghost he couldn't outrun. He put his face in his hands, the silence of the cabin pressing in. He was adrift in his own failure, the anchor of his carefully constructed solitude gone. He was lost. Through it all, the dog did not leave. Sargent didn't pace or whine. He didn't demand food or attention. He lay on the floor a few feet from Rowan's chair, his body relaxed but his head up. He did not react to Rowan's anger or his suffocating withdrawal. He simply stayed. His presence was not demanding. It was a fact, a constant. Through the long, dark hours of Rowan's emotional collapse, the dog was an unshakable, patient witness. Sometime after midnight, Rowan finally looked at him. The dog's dark eyes were on him, steady and knowing. In that gaze there was no judgment, there was no pity, there was only a profound and simple truth. I am here. I will not leave you. It was the same message Elias had left in the wreck. It was a promise of loyalty that transcended death and time and failure. The dog's unwavering presence was a lifeline. It didn't fix what was broken inside Rowan, but it stopped him from drowning in it. The quiet, breathing animal in the dark was a point of grace. Slowly, painfully, Rowan pulled himself back from the edge. He stood up, his joints stiff, and walked to the door. He picked up the container of stew Caleb had left. It was cold now, but it was there. He hadn't been as alone as he had tried to be. He opened the cabin door. The cold night air was clean and sharp. The rage had burned out, leaving a hollow ache, but also a sliver of clarity. Thorne had taken the sight, but he hadn't taken the truth. Not all of it. Rowan still had the bandana, and he had the dog. He looked down at Sargent, who had followed him to the door and now stood beside him, looking out into the darkness. The work wasn't over. The next morning, Rowan was drinking Caleb's coffee. He had come back at dawn, seen the lights on, and left a fresh thermos on the porch rail without a word, when Sargent began to act strangely. The dog, usually calm and centered, became restless. He paced the cabin, whining softly, going to the door and then back to Rowan, his claws clicking on the wood floor. Finally, he picked something up from the corner where Rowan had tossed his field jacket. It was the bandana. He brought it to Rowan and dropped it at his feet. Then he nudged Rowan's hand with his nose, hard, and looked toward the door. The message was clear. This is not over. We missed something. What is it, boy? Rowan murmured, picking up the faded fabric. It was just a piece of cloth, but to the dog, it was a key. Sargent went to the door and barked. One sharp, commanding bark. It was not a request. It was an order. Trusting the dog over his own despair, Rowan pulled on his boots and jacket. He followed Sargent out into the cold morning. The dog did not lead him toward the trail to the wreck. Instead, he took a less traveled path, one that led higher up the mountain, away from the ravine. He moved with a renewed sense of purpose, the bandana once again held gently in his mouth. He was tracking something Rowan couldn't see, a scent on the wind, a memory, a thread of a story only he could follow. They climbed for nearly an hour, the air thinning, the trees growing more sparse and weathered. Finally, Sargent stopped. They were at a small, rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley. Below, they could see the distant, ugly scar of the remediation site. But the dog wasn't looking down. He was focused on a fissure in the rock face, almost completely hidden by a stunted, wind-twisted juniper bush. Sargent dropped the bandana at the base of the bush and began to dig at the loose rock and soil, whining with excitement. Rowan knelt beside him, his heart starting to pound. He pulled away the juniper branches. Behind them, wedged deep into the crevice, was a waterproof pelican case, the kind used for sensitive electronic equipment. It was covered in dust and pine needles, but it was intact. His fingers were numb with cold and adrenaline as he worked the latches. They snapped open with a sharp crack. Inside, nestled in foam, was a small, ruggedized audio recorder and a leather-bound journal. Elias hadn't left everything in the plane. He was too smart for that. He had anticipated that the wreck might be found by the wrong people. He had made a backup. He had left a witness. Rowan spent the rest of the day in his cabin, the door locked, listening. Elias's voice, clear and steady, filled the small room. He documented everything. The crash caused by engine failure, not pilot error. His survival. His discovery that his transponder had been deliberately tampered with, broadcasting a false location miles away. He had found deposits of rare earth minerals while surveying the area for his employer, a subsidiary of the same company that owned the Green River Conservancy. He realized they had wanted him to disappear. The crash was not an accident, it was an attempted murder. The journal detailed his months of survival, his hope that Sargent, his partner, would find him, and it detailed his plan. He knew his former employers would eventually come to claim the minerals. He knew they would silence the story of the crash. So he left a trail. The wreck was the bait. The real story was here. The last entry was dated 6 months after the crash. He wrote that he was getting weaker and that he was going to try to hike out toward the east, leaving this record behind. He wrote a final message to his wife and a final word for Rowan. "Tell Rowan it wasn't his fault. Tell him to take care of my dog." Rowan sat in the silence, Elias's last words echoing in the room. The guilt didn't vanish, but its shape changed. It was no longer the formless weight of failure, but the sharp-edged reality of a crime. He called Jenna. Then he called Caleb. He told them what he had found. They met that night, not at Rowan's cabin, but at Caleb's workshop, a warm, bright space that smelled of sawdust and engine oil. The audio recorder sat on the workbench between them. Jenna listened, her face growing harder with every word from the speaker. Caleb stood by the wood stove, his arms crossed, his jaw tight with anger. Sargent lay under the workbench, his head on his paws, as if he knew his part in the story was nearing its end. When the recording finished, the silence in the workshop was heavy. "This is it," Jenna said, her voice shaking with quiet fury. "This is everything. This goes beyond a cover-up. It's attempted murder. And with the mineral survey data from the journal, it's motive." "Thorne won't just roll over," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. "A man like that has layers of protection." "He thinks he's erased the evidence," Rowan said. "He doesn't know about this. He thinks all he has to manage is me." They formed a plan, not one of violence, but of exposure. Jenna knew a journalist, a real one, who had tangled with Thorne's parent company before. Caleb knew a retired lawyer living in town, a man with a sharp mind and a distaste for corporate bullies. They weren't a squad of operators, but they were a community, a small, determined group of people who refused to let a man's life be erased for profit. Rowan, who had spent years believing he had to carry his burdens alone, realized he was not the only one standing guard. The next morning, as Jenna left with the recorder and journal carefully packed away, and the lawyer's number in her phone, Caleb walked Rowan to his truck. The sun was just starting to crest the mountains, painting the sky in pale shades of pink and gold. "He was your friend," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. "He was," Rowan said, his voice thick. Caleb didn't say he was sorry. He didn't offer platitudes. He just put a hand on Rowan's shoulder, a firm, grounding touch. He held it there a beat longer than necessary, his gaze meeting Rowan's. In that look, there was a world of understanding, of shared burdens, of loyalty, of a deep and quiet grief that needed no words. It was a moment of profound, unspoken connection. Rowan felt that familiar, unexamined ache in his chest, a warmth that spread from the point of contact. He didn't pull away. He just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of a debt he could never repay. The fallout was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, inexorable tide. The journalist Jenna contacted was tenacious. Armed with Elias's recordings and journal, she began to pull at the threads of the Green River Conservancy. The story broke, not as a local curiosity, but as a national headline. Whistleblower's final words expose corporate murder plot. Thorne and his company responded with calm, practiced denials. They painted Rowan as a disturbed veteran and the evidence as a fabrication. But Elias's voice was too compelling, the details in his journal too precise. The mineral surveys matched geological data that the company had tried to bury. Former employees, emboldened by the story, began to speak to the reporter on background. The wall of silence began to crumble, not with a bang, but with 1,000 quiet whispers that became a roar. Federal investigators, who had been stonewalled by paperwork, suddenly found their paths cleared. The NTSB report, when it was finally compiled using the data from Elias's journal, confirmed deliberate sabotage of the aircraft. Mark Thorne was arrested, not in a dramatic raid, but quietly, at his lawyer's office. The system he had used so effectively was now turning against him. The wheels of justice ground slowly, imperfectly, but they were grinding. The world was not transformed. The company Thorne worked for issued a statement, fired him, and rebranded its conservation fund. The fight would continue in courtrooms and boardrooms for years. But the truth of what happened in that ravine was no longer a secret held by the forest. Elias's story was told, his name was cleared, his last words had been heard. Rowan did not leave the mountain. The urge to run, to find a new silence, a new solitude, was a faint echo now, a habit of the blood he no longer needed to obey. He had found a reason to stay. He testified at the preliminary hearings, his voice steady and clear, his presence irrefutable. He was no longer a ghost haunting the woods. He was a witness. He chose to remain, not because the mountain was a place to hide, but because it was now a place to stand his ground. He kept checking the trails, not as an escape, but as a duty. He was a guardian of that quiet place, a keeper of its memory. He was part of the community he had held at arm's length, a community that had rallied not to save him, but to stand with him. One crisp evening, weeks later, Rowan sat on his porch. The air was cold and clean, and the first stars were appearing in the deep blue twilight. Caleb was there, sitting in the other chair, a comfortable silence between them. He had just finished securing the new porch rail, this time with steel bolts. He'd said it wouldn't come loose again. Sargent lay on the porch between them. His work was done. He was not on alert, not scanning the tree line. His head was on his paws, his tail giving a slow, rhythmic thump against the wooden planks. His breathing was deep and even. For the first time in a long time, he was simply at rest. He was a dog, in a home, between two men he trusted. His duty was discharged. His promise was kept. Rowan looked at the dog, then out at the dark silhouette of the mountain against the fading light. He thought of Elias's final words on the recording. "It wasn't your fault." He didn't know if he would ever fully believe that, but he was willing to carry it now, not as a crushing weight, but as a sacred charge. The guilt had become a form of love, the grief a form of loyalty. He understood now that faith was not about the absence of darkness, but about the choice to light a lamp in it. It was about staying when every instinct screamed to run. It was about the quiet, stubborn belief that a single, steady presence could hold back the night. It was the loyalty of a dog who carried a memory for miles, the trust of a friend who showed up with coffee in the cold, the courage of a man who spoke his truth into a recorder, believing someone, someday, would listen. Sometimes, the most profound act of faith is simply to stay, to stand your ground, to bear witness, and to trust that you are not standing alone.